Hey guys, and welcome to today's video, how to make a fabric bow. We're gonna go over how to determine the dimensions, draft it, cut it out, and sew it all together. Here's a list of supplies. For pattern making, you'll need vellum paper, scissors, pencil eraser, dress pins, and a transparent ruler. For sewing, you'll need the fabric, thread, gauge ruler, dress pins, and seam ripper. The first thing I like to do is to make a sketch of whatever I plan on making. So let's make a sketch of the bow. Next, you need to determine how big you want it to be. You could grab a measuring tape, hold it up in the mirror, and kind of determine the size. For this bow, I want to make it rather large, so each of the sides will be 7 inches long, 7 inches wide, and 2 inches in the center. Next, we're going to want to determine what our pattern piece is going to look like. So for the bow itself, it's ultimately just a large rectangle, and for the center part of the bow is a long, skinny rectangle. So we need to determine what the length of each of the sides of our pattern will be. So the top of the large rectangle we know is going to be 7 plus 2 plus 7. So we're going to add all of those up, which is 16. And that is the length we want. But we need to take into consideration the seam allowance. The seam allowance we're going to use today is a 1/2 inch. So we're going to add a 1/2 inch to all sides of our pattern. A lot of times with store-bought patterns, the seam allowance is 5/8. It kind of just depends on what you want to use. I prefer to use a 1/2 inch, so that's what we'll be using today. So if you add a 1/2 inch to each side, that equals 1 inch. And you take 16 plus 1, and that's 17 inches. Next, we're going to determine the sides of the pattern. We know that the length is 7 plus our 1/2 inch and 1/2 inch, which equals 1. So our side will be 8, and our top will be 17. Next, we're going to figure out the centerpiece of the pattern. So that's 2 inches wide plus our 1/2 inch and 1/2 inch. So the width will be 3 inches. Now this centerpiece is gonna wrap around the bow. So let's make that one a little bit longer. Let's go with 4 inches plus our 1/2 inch and 1/2 inch, which equals 1. So that puts our long piece at 3 by 5 and our big bow rectangle piece 17 by 8. So now let's draft our pattern. When starting off making your pattern, I like to line up my ruler at the edge of like a table, so I know that it's a nice straight line to start out with. So go ahead and draw a line with your ruler and make sure that it is nice and straight. Now we know the bottom of the rectangle needs to be 17 inches long, so go ahead and mark 17 inches. Next, we know that the height of the pattern piece needs to be 8 inches. So go ahead and mark in several different spots 8 inches so that when we go to make the rectangle, we're pretty much just connecting the dots. Now let's go ahead and draw the sides of the rectangle. Again, when you're going to draw these side lines, use the bottom of the table and the ruler to make sure that it's going to be lined up in a straight line. So go ahead and draw the right and the left side. And then you'll already have your marks at the top. So you know exactly where your top line needs to be, and just go ahead and connect the dots. Now you're going to go ahead and true your pattern, so draw past the lines you've made so you have a very crisp edge so you know exactly where the pattern needs to be cut. Then you're going to mark a grain line. A grain line is very important. Make it about 2 inches wide, and that's going to help you determine where to set your pattern on the fabric. Now we're going to draw the centerpiece, and we know the centerpiece is 3 inches wide by 5 inches high. So again, line it up, make sure the lines are straight, and draw that centerpiece of your pattern. True up the edges of this pattern piece as well, and make sure you mark a grain line so you know where to place the pattern piece on the fabric. You must have a grain line on every pattern piece that you make. Go ahead and cut out each of your pieces. Make sure you follow the lines really carefully and make sure that you label what the pattern pieces are. I also include how many I'm going to cut on each pattern piece. I like to write that down, so I'll be cutting 2 of the large rectangle and 2 of the small. All right, go ahead and grab the fabric that you plan on using. The fabric I'm using is actually a Dupioni silk, so it's thick. It's really gonna hold the shape of the bow really well. If your fabric is not thick and it's thinner, you might wanna add some interfacing and iron that to it so that your bow has a really nice shape. All right, let's get those pattern pieces laid on our fabric. You want to do it so your fabric is facing right sides together, and you're going to see this edge on your fabric that kind of has a factory finish. That's the selvage edge. So go ahead and place selvage to selvage and pin those together. And then you want to think about where you want to place the pattern. You want to try to conserve as much of the fabric as possible so you can maybe use it for other projects. So I would suggest finding a nice straight edge of the fabric. I'm going to use this corner here. And then you want to place your grain line so that it's parallel to the folded edge of the fabric and to the selvage edge. Use your ruler and line it up so that you know that the pattern piece is lying vertically on the fabric. I'm going to place my pattern piece against the top, but I don't want to place it all the way against the side of the selvage edge because I don't want my pattern piece to have that factory finish. So I'm going to move it about a 1/2 inch away from that selvaged edge. I'm going to pin it and then go ahead and start to cut the pattern piece out. If you feel like the fabric is starting to move around on you, you can use like a fabric weight or anything heavy. Then go ahead and cut out the center piece of the bow, line it up so that the grain line is vertical and the pattern piece is sitting properly. Place a few pins in it so it doesn't move around and cut that piece out as well. All right, now that the pattern pieces are cut out, let's get sewing. Go ahead and remove the pattern from your fabric, and you're going to sew the large rectangle first, and it's going to be a 1/2 inch seam allowance all the way around the entire thing. Go ahead and place it under the machine and make sure you're sewing at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Don't forget to backstitch at the beginning and the end of each of your seams. So keep in mind that you're gonna need to turn this rectangle inside out. So you're gonna need to leave an opening that's about 3 inches wide so that you can do that. I would suggest having that opening being on the long side of the rectangle and having it be in the center as well. So make sure you leave that opening, backstitch when you start sewing, and continue the stitch all the way down. Go ahead and sew the center piece of the bow next. You don't need to sew the area that's 3 inches long. That you can leave open because we're gonna finish that off by hand, and you need to turn the piece inside out anyway. So go ahead and just sew the sides at a 1/2 inch and backstitch at the top and bottom. Now it's time to trim. So the first thing you'll do is trim the corners. So if you look, there's kind of like an X marks the spot on each of the edges. So you're going to snip right in the center of that. You want to make sure you do not cut through the actual stitches, but you need to put a little slit so that you're able to make those edges pointy when we turn it inside out. Then go ahead and start trimming around the entire rectangle. The area that you've left open, don't trim that as close because you want to lip on that so that you're able to turn it and hand sew it. But you can pretty much trim and leave about a 1/4 inch seam allowance around the rest of the rectangle. Once you've trimmed the large rectangle, move right onto the small. Go ahead and trim each side at about a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Okay, let's turn this thing inside out. So go ahead and do that, and then you're gonna need some sort of tool or instrument. I like to use my scissors. You might wanna use like the rounded edge of a seam ripper or maybe like a rounded edge of like a pencil, but you're gonna take that and put it through the opening of the rectangle and kind of maneuver it in all 4 corners. You wanna help make it kind of pointy, and you wanna be careful, especially if you're using scissors, that you don't push it through too hard. You do not wanna puncture the fabric or put a hole in it, but you're gonna need some sort of tool to kind of get in there and make it a nice pointy edge. All right, now that we got this all turned inside out, let's make it nice and crisp and really pretty and go ahead and iron all around the edge of the rectangle and the centerpiece. Next, you're going to use a slip stitch technique to close the opening of the rectangle. So use 1-ply thread, go ahead and anchor it in one side, and then you're gonna kind of maneuver it between each of the layers where it's folded. So we're gonna go through the bottom, pull it through, and then go through the top. So again, it's through the bottom. You can see the thread is at the bottom, and then you're gonna put it right through the top. And you wanna kind of hide it. The whole idea is that you don't see the stitch. And again, we're gonna go through the bottom. You can see this thread is at the top. So now we're gonna go through the bottom in the little folded area, bring that through, and now we're gonna go from the bottom to the top and put the needle through that folded edge. You're gonna continue that all the way across. And when you're doing it, make sure you pull the thread nice and tight because you want it to look like it has a machine finish to it. Okay, let's determine the center of the rectangle. So go ahead and fold it in half, iron it, and then get like some wax chalk and a ruler and draw right on that ironed line. It's okay that it's showing because this is the back of the bow. No one's going to see it. Now you need to have 2-ply thread and make sure you put a knot in the bottom. So now we're going to pleat the bow. So using that line as a guideline, we're gonna pleat it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 total. So once you have it pleated, check the right side of the bow, the side that doesn't have the line, and make sure all of those creases are nice and even. And then grab your needle and start kind of tacking where the white line is so that you keep it in place. It doesn't really matter if the sewing's super neat because you're not going to see that anyway. Now we're gonna place that centerpiece over the bow. So flip the bow over so that you can see the line that you originally marked. Place that centerpiece right over it, fold it under, and now we're gonna tack it into place. It might be best to anchor it in one of the pleats and have it be 2-ply thread and then sew it all the way across. Make sure at the end you tie it in several knots so that that does not move and it's nice and secure. Next, grab the other end of the centerpiece, fold that under by hand. Again, anchor it to one of the pleated areas so that it anchors in, and then go ahead and sew that through. Again, the sewing doesn't have to be perfect. You're not going to see this anyway. This is the back of the bow, but go ahead and sew it all the way through so it hits through both of the layers because you don't want that centerpiece to move. And make sure that you tie it off with a knot at the end. When you're sewing it, also make sure that you can stick your finger through the bow. That way, if you want to put the bow on a belt, that it'll easily slide through something. So go ahead and finish off the edge, put the needle through both edges of the fabric, make sure it's nice and tight, make sure you can get your finger through that centerpiece, and to make sure that it's not gonna move, I would definitely anchor it again on another pleated area and tie it in a knot several times. And there you have it, a really nice fabric bow. You can wear it on so many different things. And remember guys, if you like this video and want to see more, please subscribe below.